Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth week of our class. So, at the end of this week, I want you to give me a proposal for the first paper. I've put the paper assignment along with a PowerPoint that I put together a couple years ago on paper writing at the top of our Venkel Hall page for this course. It's a narrated PowerPoint, so you can either read through my slides or just click play to hear me talking. I don't use that format for these presentations just because these get a little large and unwieldy if I use the PowerPoint format, whereas YouTube is a wonderful place just to post these videos. They seem to have unlimited hosting space, which is wonderful. So anyways, I've given you two paper topics, though I'm trying to be clear that you can write about any topic you want so long as you get me a proposal and do the work of framing a proper research project and then are able to tie that to some sort of history within the period we're covering. So for the proposal that's due at the end of the week, I want to see that you have a topic, at least one scholarly or primary source to analyze, and a thesis, meaning a clear argument about your topic. And I go into this more in my supplemental PowerPoint presentation. So last week I alluded to a paper topic that I've given students in the past and decided to go with it again. So if you're interested, you can write a paper that compares two very different Wikipedia articles about the Mongols, one from a Russian perspective and one from a Mongolian perspective. Typically, I don't consider Wikipedia to be a scholarly source. It's a wonderful introductory source, a place to start your research, but in most cases, it's not a clearinghouse for focused research. That's not to say that their editing standards aren't high, and I like that they are peer-reviewed by the world, which when it comes to more popular articles means that they have very high levels of quality and accuracy. But Wikipedia is still an introductory source, so when you're writing papers, I want to see that you can research and find peer-reviewed materials from either academic or mainstream reputable publishers. Go ahead and use Wikipedia to familiarize yourself with the topic. Just don't cite it. What I want you to cite is the more focused stuff that sometimes you can find within Wikipedia articles. Follow the little hyperlinks at the end. Again, because they're well written. So, I go over tools to find scholarly sources in the PowerPoint as well. So here's where it gets tricky. If you pick my first paper topic, you can actually just use Wikipedia. But remember, I'm asking you to summarize. I'm not asking you to summarize what you find in these two articles. I'm asking you to have a sophisticated thesis analyzing why their perspectives are different. So this will take some work. For every other topic, I want you to find at least one scholarly source and to answer a question about the topic you propose. Basically, I want you to have a thesis. I want you to have a point, not just be writing about something descriptively. So if you have any questions, please email me. And remember, I have office hours every morning from 9 to 10 a.m., Monday through Friday. So this week, we're doing something similar to what we did in the first week of class. I've got readings from the periphery, not of the archaic globalization system that we've been talking about, but of the Mongol Empire. So last week, we talked about the destruction wrought by the Mongols. This week, however, I want to look at two examples, those of the traveler Ibn Battuta and the trader, politician, financier Pegelotti, to show that, while short-lived, the Mongol Empire offered a kind of stability that allowed certain types of trade and contact to flourish. I've also got a snippet into a fun letter exchange between Guyuk Khan and Pope Innocent IV. Then I've got the introduction to one of the best books out there on the Black Plague. So lots of short readings to help you imagine a larger world picture during the period of Mongol dominance and the Black Plague that followed it. So in the excerpt I gave you, let me try and switch here. In the excerpt that I gave you from The Secret History of the Mongols last week, one of the things you saw was that there was tension among Genghis Khan's four main sons, those who were his sons from Borte, his first wife. So three of the brothers believed Jochi to be illegitimate, as he was born only shortly after his mother was rescued from kidnapping. Genghis didn't care and always treated Jochi as if he was his own, but tension remained between Jochi and his brothers as well as their descendants. So in the 1230s and 1240s, Jochi's son, Batu, as well as another of Genghis's sons, Ogodei, along with several of Ogodei's sons, including Guyuk, were in charge of conquering Russia and then pushing into Eastern Europe. In 1241, they attacked Hungary and made it as far as Croatian a Croatian fortress on the Adriatic Sea. This is very, very close to Rome. The Adriatic Sea is not a very wide place. So the Mongols never conquered Hungary though, and lost interest in expanding farther into Europe after this incursion. This seems to have had more to do with infighting among their leadership, Genghis Khan's immediate descendants, than any problem with European resistance. So an early example of this tension was between Batu and Guyuk. Batu is the one who had found the Golden Horde and ruled over much of Russia and the steppes beyond that, what you read about last week. He had a falling out with Guyuk at a victory celebration shortly after their attack on Hungary. This falling out would split the empire, leading Guyuk back to Karakorum, where he faced the wrath of his father. Despite this, Guyuk eventually rose in the ranks to be elected the Great Khan. So one of Batu's brothers, Berke, a devout Muslim, was also the one who led the attack on Hulagu after he sacked Baghdad. So basically, all these details, what I'm trying to say is that the cousins of a family of some of the fiercest warriors in history didn't get along with each other. So I'm giving you all of this background. Oh, I've got split screen, so it's a little hard for me to switch slides when I want to. Here we go. Okay. So I'm giving you all of this background family information to explain that by the mid-1240s, Western Europeans didn't need to worry about Mongol invasions anymore. Mongols lacked the unity to mount any sort of sustained attack on Europe, but Europeans, they didn't know that, and they had only recently suffered incursions from Poland to the Holy Roman Empire, all the way down to Bulgaria, including Hungary and Croatia that I just mentioned. So Pope Innocent IV, in desperation, figured he'd at least try to invite the Mongols to do the only thing he could think of to maybe make them stop when he was powerless: embrace Christianity. And hopefully that would calm them down a bit. So this is one of your readings for this week. When emissaries to Karakorum arrived with their petition from the Pope, they were there just in time to see Guyuk crowned as the Great Khan. When they presented the letter to him, he responded in Persian, a language everyone could understand, by essentially making fun of the Pope, saying, "Your God must prefer me since I rule a vast empire and you don't." So on this slide, I want to point out some of the other things that were concerning to the papacy of Innocent IV. He wasn't just worried about the Mongols. Crusader states were in trouble, and he was desperately trying to get aid to them, but he also had to contend with the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, who was on friendly terms with Islamic powers, and seemed almost an atheist in his everyday flouting of church rules. And Frederick II, too, seemed to enjoy picking at the barely healed over scab of the investiture controversy, so much so that the Pope felt he had to excommunicate him. Excommunication was by then a tried and true method to deal with deviant Holy Roman emperors. So I've got some maps I want to, scrolling over. So I really, really like these maps. They, you've got the large one on the right and then the one inset on the left. And they illustrate so nicely two very different approaches to statecraft. On the right, you've got the largest empire in the history of the world, but one with very light governance from the top that emphasized more the collection of tribute and the protection of trade routes. There were certainly sophisticated elements to the empire, especially in Yuan dynasty China, but farther west, like in the area controlled by the Golden Horde, the Mongols were little more than a protection racket. Basically, pay us or we'll burn your city and kill a bunch of people. So in Italy, by contrast, in the period of late antiquity, when the power of Rome was finally gone, many communes developed, often marginally within larger entities like the Holy Roman Empire or even the Byzantine Empire. They were, by contrast with the Mongols, tightly administered microstates. These communes were sometimes republics seeking to keep the institutions that allowed Rome to flourish. They were small, commercially oriented states with incredibly high standards of living due to trade and the smart management of finance. The European banking tradition had its origins in these city-states and the policies of powerful families like the Medicis of Florence. Let me try and switch. So Venice was perhaps the most prosperous of these republics, and one that would become a powerful maritime empire in its own right. I want to briefly go over a few of their features to explain why they were so well poised to take advantage of the new opportunities opened up by the Mongols. Venetia was the base of the trader-traveler Marco Polo, whose account would be a bestseller in Europe for centuries. So the capital of the Venetian Empire was Venice, and it is a city built both for and by commerce. It's constructed on a series of islands inside the Venetian lagoon, which you can see just sort of the edge of in this picture. Um, it, which, that lagoon offers wonderful ports in calm water. The city is crisscrossed by canals, as water transportation was, and frankly still is, the cheapest kind of transportation. In Venice, merchants could sail directly to their location, unload, then reload for maximum efficiency. The Republic formed as early as 697, so just right in the period of late antiquity, and lasted until Napoleon took the city in 1797. So, a long time, more than 1,000 years. At its height, it consisted of a series of trading ports with territory stretching from northern Italy and the Alps all the way down the Adriatic to the Anatolian Peninsula, including the islands of Rhodes, Crete, and the Ionian Peninsula, so key areas of Greece. For centuries, they managed to negotiate more powerful neighbors like the Byzantines, of whom they were technically once a part, as well as the Holy Roman Empire, similarly to which they were technically a part. But the real focus of the empire was on trade. When the Crusades happened, for example, the Venetians grew wealthy, ferrying crusaders and supplies across the Mediterranean. Their motives were hardly holy. In 1204, for example, they sensed weakness in Constantinople, the city that the Crusades were supposed to save to begin with, and Venetians played a key role in an attack against the city. Um, their sacking of Constantinople was absolutely devastating. At other times, though, they would make pragmatic alliances, as they did with the Pope during the investiture controversy against their own Holy Roman Emperor. So, this is the empire from which Marco Polo set out with his father and uncles. Um, I just have a picture here, if I can get to it. So, of his travels. His uncles would leave Marco Polo as a hostage in the court of Kublai Khan, where Polo would marvel at the wonders of Chinese culture and the power of the Mongol Empire over it. He would remain away from Venice for 24 years. When he returned, he was put into prison, and it was there that he wrote his travel account that would inspire generations of Europeans and generations of explorers as well. So, a competitor of Venice was nearby Florence. The Florentine Republic was established in 1115, and like Venice, it was a city-state that balked at the restrictions of other parts of feudal Europe. These were cities whose wealth came from trade, less so the accumulation of excess agricultural production from serfs, as was the norm in so much of Europe. Because of its ties with the Islamic world, Florence would be one of the avenues where Greek and Arabic philosophy and science were rediscovered by Europe, leading to the Renaissance, whose epicenter was absolutely Florence. So, one of your fun readings for this week is from a traveler in Florence, who was in Florence. He never traveled himself. His name was Pegilotti. His Guide for Traveling in the East is an absolutely fascinating book with quite a bit of insight into what the world of 14th century Eurasian traders looked like. Pegilotti was a financier, he was a politician in the local Florentine Senate, but he didn't actually go to any of these places, but he had a tremendous amount of reliable information from other traders. And I really like the little mundane details he focuses on in this excerpt. So I hope you have fun with the focus questions drawing from this reading. Another one of your readings then jumps back to the Mali Empire, which we've dealt with in the past. Here's a wonderful mosque in Timbuktu that still exists. So, uh, Ibn, this is the traveler account of Ibn Battuta, who visited Niani, which was the capital of the Mali Empire, in 1352. Ibn Battuta came from a wealthy Moroccan family and had the resources to spend almost 30 years traveling all over the world, largely staying within the world of Islam. He was an early witness to the Black Plague in Persia and the Middle East, and had returned home in 1349 to try to escape it. But he felt the travel bug again and came to Mali shortly after returning home. I hope you enjoy this brief excerpt and see how a Muslim who considered himself an an expert on the global practice of the religion evaluated Mali. He praises things, for instance, like their devotion, but found some practices, like this lack of segregation between the sexes, among other things, to be strange. And that's, travel accounts almost always have comments on what they feel to be strange and what they feel to be amazing. So it wasn't just Ibn Battuta's vacations, though, that were uh, put on hold by the plague. It was, basically the world that was destroyed, too. So the last time I actually talked about the plague with a History 125 class, I was in a classroom, and it was February of this year, 2020. And I had a few students at that time make comments relating to coronavirus. And we compared the two, the Black Plague, to what we knew about COVID-19 at the time. Oh, I have a friend. Just let me figure out how to pause this. So, anyways, in February, I was confident that robust global public health programs would be successful in containing its spread long enough for a vaccine to be developed. I thought we would deal with coronavirus the same way we dealt with Ebola and swine flu very recently. And I also didn't think that the death toll would be very high. So now that 204,000 Americans have died and 7 million have tested positive, I feel a little less confident, as I think many of you probably do too. To put that into perspective, though, this is huge. One out of every 1,500 Americans have died, which means all of us very likely know someone, and if we don't know someone, we know someone who knows someone who's lost their life. But not to seem cheesy, but there's absolutely room for optimism still. Original projections based on what was happening in Wuhan province were that without mitigating measures, two-thirds of any population would contract the virus within weeks. Our 7 million cases certainly is vastly underreported because of lack of testing in the US, but it is still far lower than two-thirds of our population, which would be 200 million people. So 7 million is less than 200 million. That's room for optimism right there. And the best projections are that without prevention or treatment, 2 to 3% of those who contract the virus die from it. So that would mean that had we done nothing in our country, there would be a death toll of 4 to 6 million Americans right now. So 200,000 is a lot less, and hopefully we will keep that number down as we wait a few more months for a vaccine. So on the bright side, despite our politicization of the virus and serious stress on both healthcare and public health, our situation is a lot better than it could be. So please avoid large gatherings, practice social distancing, wear a mask, wash your hands, all that good stuff. Stuff that people didn't do in Europe 700 years ago. So even under a worst case scenario, though, coronavirus is nothing like the Black Plague. And under our current scenario, I'm confident that we will beat this within a few months, and I will see you all in a physical classroom soon rather than recording things for YouTube, usually in my basement bunker, but right now upstairs in my kids' playroom. So the plague originated in Central Asia and devastated the heartland of the Mongols, for starters. The Yuan dynasty would end because of instability brought on by the plague. Death tolls from the plague were between 1/4 and 1/2 of populations affected. To try to imagine, if you can, what happens when that many people almost immediately disappear. People would die within a 24 to 48 hours of contracting the plague. For most of us, it's the kind of thing we've only experienced through post-apocalyptic disaster movies. That kind of massive death destroys the living as well. It destroys the societies that prop up everyone. So the plague, it would spread to Crimea by 1346, made it to the Italian city-state of Genoa, one which I didn't mention earlier, by 1347, and from there it rapidly spread into virtually all of Europe, all of the Middle East, seriously into North Africa. Research is only beginning now on its effects in West and Central and East Africa. So in Europe, the best reconstructions seem to be that 1/3 to a half of populations in affected areas perished. This caused horrific social breakdowns too, long after the plague ended. In France, for example, here we go. The plague occurred while the country was still in the midst of the Hundred Years' War, which is an odd yet oddly destructive dispute between the British royal house of Plantagenet and the French House of Valois. And frankly, me even using those terms, British and French, are anachronistic because the whole dispute was whether or not France was part of one dynasty or another. The rulers weren't necessarily initially using national terms. So there are a lot of events during this war that you've probably heard of before, like the uprising of Joan of Arc, and maybe this one, the Jacquerie, which really cemented a French identity for people. Ironically, the English, whose royalty still largely spoke French at the time, also had a very, remember, William the Conqueror was a Norman French person, and the English ruling class and nobility for the next several centuries largely spoke French. Medieval French, not like modern French. So, even though the nobility and royalty still largely spoke French at the time, uh, the English also had a very English nationalist moment during this war, which, the Hundred Years' War, it was not 100 years, it lasted about 20 years longer. So, just 10 years after the plague had devastated much of France, those who survived it began to feel that their labor was worth more than it had been previously. Many ordinary peasants felt like they shouldn't have to pay excessive poll taxes anymore, and that they shouldn't be required to give the same amount of labor with as little recompense as before. And in fact, many were required to give more labor because there were fewer of them alive, so the fewer people needed to work harder. So, at the Battle of Poitiers, they used the pretext of the nobles abandoning the king as a reason to revolt in the name of protecting their king against their more immediate oppressors, the nobility. This was a common strategy for peasant revolts for centuries in many parts of the world, to assume that the king was good, but his ministers or nobles were corrupt. The response of nobles to the Jacquerie uprising, meaning uprising of the Jacques, or ordinary people, was a horrifying bloodbath, essentially beating peasants back into submission. So there was a similar response to an uprising in England that I want to briefly cover. Come on, cursor. Are you there? There we go. Which was the other side of the Hundred Years' War at the end of the 1300s. Oh, just a second. I have nothing. Okay, so peasants in England felt like their duties needed to be relieved as there were so few of them left. They were also protesting within the context of the early English enclosure movement. I have an idea, Sam. Sorry, I'll just pause for a second. Okay, my son and his friend are setting up a cool war scene while I'm talking about the Hundred Years' War, so makes sense. So, anyways, they they were protesting in England within the context of the early English enclosure movement, where previously common lands were being fenced off. So, where poor people used to be able to graze livestock, that land was now only available to the rich, who were growing things like wool for export. Uh, you know, wool from northern climates is always better than wool from other areas. So growing sheep also takes significantly less labor than growing grains, so those who weren't overworked found themselves without work. So the ideas of two people have been preserved from this uprising in England. The preacher John Ball, who advocated a radical form of equality, and the traveling agitator Wat Tyler. We presume that he was a tile layer based on his last name, and that meant that he was a tradesperson who had the freedom to move about more than ordinary peasants did. So Ball was a part of a group of clergy who called themselves Lollards, as they advocated radical equality between believers, that all are equal before God, hence no need to treat nobility differently than anyone else. John Wycliffe was one of these people too, a Lollard, who is known within the same period for writing the first English translation of the Bible. He was burned at the stake for his heresy. So anyways, Ball and Tyler's uprising ended much the same as the earlier French Jacquerie, with serious oppression and a reestablishment of the feudal order. Um, so there are plenty of people who, for centuries have tied the brilliant Italian Renaissance to the Black Plague. And, it's a little bit of a macabre thing to do. But if you're going to do it, one of the easiest ways to do it is by focusing on the person of Petrarch, a thinker who actually came up with the term Renaissance or rebirth to argue that the re-examination of classical ideas in his era was waking Europe up from the dark ages they had experienced since the fall of Rome. One of the places that the Renaissance had its greatest financial support was in the Republic of Florence. The Medici family of Florence that I mentioned earlier had grown by the 1400s into, and again, this is after the plague, into the most powerful banking and trade family in Europe. One of the Medicis, who went by the name of Lorenzo di Medici il Magnifico, was the person behind the politics of the town, controlling everything through his massive ability to finance artwork, trade, philosophy, literature, and the great Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci, also a Florentine. So we'll be dealing with the ideas of the Renaissance thinkers and later humanists in future weeks, but for now we can frame the Renaissance as a turning point on the transformation of the post-archaic world that we started this semester with. And in the person of Petrarch in particular, it was a direct consequence of the plague. He lost a son in the plague, and for him, it was suddenly this moment where he said, "Man, what really matters in life? The accumulation of wealth or the accumulation of knowledge, science, culture, and religious things of religion that actually matter." So, okay, you've got some bonus questions below, and I wish you a good week overall. As always, please reach out if you would like to go over anything at all. And I think I need to help my kids and their friend with their war now.